So I should probably begin by saying that I am one of the people identified with the whole effort to securitize the environment, not only academically. I produced a series of books, one with Dan Dudney, Contested Ground, where we laid this out early in the process, Conserving the Peace with Mark Halley, where we tried to link it to peace, Global Environmental Change and Human Security with John Barnett and Karen O'Brien, where we tried to link it to human security. And I have a book with Rita Floyd, which reviews the efforts of the past 20 years. So I'm associated with this in the academic world. I also was very deeply involved in the practitioner world in the same activity of the US government and in the UN. I'm going to talk about those things today. I'll tell you a little bit about, let's see. So I'll say a little bit about the center. I won't have you read that, but we focus a lot on environmental and security research in a number of areas. And we also have a lab which looks at the ways in which knowledge, stuff from the knowledge community, research, can be effectively communicated to the practitioner community, largely through documentary film and social media campaigns. And so we're the people who have done a lot of the analysis of everything from inconvenient truth, last coordination, to last quality analysis, and so on. And so we sort of, we analyze this. We work pretty closely with the documentary film industry as they try and convey these issues. What I want to do is talk first a little bit of, provide a little bit of context for this. And I don't know how familiar you people are with this, with the field, but I'll break it up into three parts. Early in the process, of course, there were people like Homer Dixon and later Colin Powell and so on, making the argument that we could, that changes in resource availability of some sort could be linked fairly explicitly through models to violent conflict. But very quickly, they and many others backed away from this position and started to argue that there's an awful lot that mediates between changes in the environment and social outcomes. There's technology, there's human ingenuity, there's political institutions, there's what happens to neighboring countries. So simple models of cause and effect, almost everybody abandoned, even though they still are raised by critics of this as if people in the field still think this way. But these were largely abandoned. And Homer Dixon himself is a prime example of this, who moved very quickly to arguing about complexity. And when he didn't say we can go from resource scarcity to conflict, he said we live in a very complex world. So actually, his argument goes, there might be a connection between resource scarcity and violent conflict. Then he says, then he modified and said, well, it depends on whether ingenuity is delivered to zones of scarcity quickly enough to avoid, violent conflict. And then he said, actually, the world is so complex that we can't really trace these out very well. But what we know from complexity theory is that there's lots of opportunity for breakdown and collapse. And so his thinking really evolved. Is it the final word? No, but it is not a simple model of some change in natural resource availability leading to some bleak social outcome. So that sort of argument, the resource wars argument, although there are still people, Michael Clare and so on, who continue to write about this, it's rather a minority position. Lots of people were focusing on the opportunity to change this apparatus which had grown up during the Cold War in the academic world, which focused on the choices were sort of Hedley Bull versus Kenneth Waltz, and people wanted to sort of undermine that way of thinking. And for many people, it was a return to what we know. So if these people sort of saw as in their intellectual history, writers like Hobbes, it was to argue that actually writers like Hobbes were not about protecting territory or the state apparatus, but about protecting people. And we should move to talking about protecting people again. And then there were people who tried to especially in the science community, who were developing models saying, if we hold constant human adjustment to signals, and we just look at broad trajectories, things look quite bleak along a lot of the resource changes that we're expecting while we're still. All right. So in this context, a number of people raised concerns about linking this, about all of these things, about saying, and Dan Dudney was one of the early ones. Mark Moody, I think Larry sort of raised this in his presentation, raised concerns about, do we even want to bring these two things together? Environmental change of some sort, global environmental change, and security. Whether it's for better understandings of what was going on in the world, whether it's to try and shift the discourse in the academic community, whether it's to try and make sense of these models coming out of the IPCC. And they sort of worried about would this be a platform for extraordinary measures, for secrecy, for mindsets which were ultimately going to undermine the important ethic or ethos of the environmental movement and of science collaboration. Now, they have never really offered any empirical support that this has happened, that any of these concerns have been well founded. So we don't get very much empirical support for the claim that this linkage creates a platform for the use of extraordinary measures, for example, or for moving into a domain of secrecy, or for an us versus them mindset. And so one of the things that they need to do now, after 20 years, is not continue to speculate on the dangers of this linkage, but actually provide some evidence for why this linkage has been counterproductive or dangerous over the past 20 years. And that I'm not so sure is there. So there's a need for empirical support. And I want to talk about three cases, the three cases that we've worked on, that I've been involved in, and sort of make the case for why I think that there were some benefits to doing this. And the first thing has to do with the situation in the United States at the end of the Cold War. I think we have to remember that for many people, the end of the Cold War was an important constitutive moment for the United States. And it was not a constitutive moment around development or human rights. It was around security. And people remember the importance of George Kennedy after World War II saying the next threat is the Soviet Union. And an entire architecture developed around that. So the question for environmentalists was, given the information coming out of the IPCC, given our common future, given Rio, should we stand back from this table, from this discussion, from this potentially constitutive moment in the U.S. redefining its role in the world, or should we at least try and participate in some way? Should we bring the environmental perspective into it? Or should we just let it be a discussion of drug trafficking and terrorism and Islam and these sorts of things? And if you remember the discourse, there were those people saying, it's sort of John Mearsheimer, back to the future. We're going back to the unstable conditions that existed in the world prior to the Cold War. Other people arguing the Soviets were not down and out. They would re-emerge. Other people arguing, well, they'll be replaced by China. There was this concern about a three-block world, North America and the EU and something close around China. There were all these other concerns that people were discussing. And so it seemed important for some people, and there was a debate in the environmental community in the United States, should we be part of this discussion? And people like Dan Dooney said, no, we should not. We should not be part of this discussion. I will not go to Washington and participate in these discussions. And other people like Homer Dixon say, of course I'm going to go there, and of course I'll participate, and we need to get this perspective into this discussion. But I think that we have to remember that this was a very important moment for the United States. There was a lot on the table, and potentially a great deal at stake. And of course, Clinton and Gore were very receptive to the idea that the environment was important. So they were very receptive to people like Robert Kaplan. Now, Robert Kaplan's argument was, in many ways, it was a journalist's account of research which was at a very preliminary phase also. So here was a journalist describing research at a very preliminary phase and providing an argument for how this helped us better understand what happened in Rwanda, or Haiti, or Somalia, or Burundi, or any of these other places that Clinton and Gore were worried about. And both of them thought, well, this makes some intuitive sense. We understand that the academic world is still working out the details, but there's some intuitive sense that these types of pressures that the IPCC and other groups are identifying is going to play out in society in important ways. So it makes sense. And they invested heavily into some very substantial policy initiatives. Remember, DOD, they opened up intelligence, they opened up DOD, they introduced an enormous amount of civilian activity into high levels of the Department of Defense. They expanded environmental security. They started to look for forms of cooperation with the Soviet Union around cleaning up the legacy of the Cold War, these sorts of things. They did it a whole lot motivated by the belief that environmental change was an important issue and needed to be addressed at the highest levels of governance. Would we agree with everything they did? Did everything they do work out? No, obviously not. But there was a moment there when they were very receptive to this, and they built an architecture which continues to exist. Much of it was dismantled by Bush, Cheney, Rumsfeld, and so on in the years afterwards. There was tremendous pushback from elements within the Department of Defense who said, you know, we are primarily an ass-kicking kinetic force. And what you're trying to do is push us into a closer relationship with development. That's your hidden agenda, is to move defense dollars towards things like sustainable development. We know what you're trying to do. You're trying to blunt us. You're trying to take away our ability to be just the people who you call upon when you need kinetic energy. And you're trying to get us to agree that maybe more money should be going into aid, maybe more money should be going into diplomacy, and not so much into the use of force. So there was a tremendous amount of pushback, and Bush, Cheney, and Rumsfeld looked at this and they said, you're basically, the environmental security agenda is weakening our ability to apply force. And we're tough guys. We're tough guys in the world. So so they began to dismantle elements of that. Now, they could not dismantle it all, and lots of people in the architecture of U.S. security continue to be worried about this, and so on. And so you still have the legacy of this period, the idea of what would be the humanitarian role of the Department of Defense. Yeah, they take on their own take, as how do we operate in extreme conditions, and we need to be more energy efficient because it's in our interest to do so and so. But there's also this long-term debate over what's the proper allocation of resources among defense, diplomacy, and development. And that debate was driven largely by the idea that the environment mattered to the security of people around the world, and that the U.S. might benefit by putting more money into water infrastructure or food security or supporting technical assessments of the needs of places, and less into simply military buildup around the world. The interest was rekindled a little bit in 2007 by the sort of this bizarre wave of rediscovery around the IPCC reports. And most recently, it has achieved this contemporarily powerful formulation in the report that came out from the National Research Council on the security implications of hydrological change in the Himalaya and the Kush. This is an interesting thing, because on the one hand, this was a report prepared by scientists. So there were sort of 17 scientists, mostly hydrological scientists, who looked at, and I was part of that team, so I sort of have a bit of a bias on that, I suppose. But if you look at that report, which is now, the draft version is online, the published version comes out in the next few days. It's a lot of science, which really provides quite a much more nuanced understanding of climate change impacts, and the links between groundwater change and climate change, and what we really understand is happening to monsoon and to ice and snow melt and so on. And it's much more nuanced. This is not a simple model of global warming, flooding, and scarcity, sort of the way that it was presented just a decade ago. This is we're dealing with a very complicated set of relationships and so on. And it's quite cautious about the security implications of this. It looked at the potential for upsetting agricultural systems and the potential for some public health setbacks, and the ways in which this might make it more of a challenge for people to collaborate around sharing water information, something we already see in this part of the world, and so on. So, but it's quite cautious. But the point is, who are the people who wanted this and are using it? In large ways, it's all those people that Clinton and Gore put in place 20 years ago. They're still there. They're either in the government or they're in the consulting circle around DC, but they're still there, and their thinking has evolved and become more mature and more sophisticated and more nuanced. was bringing the environment into the discussion that Clinton and Gore were overseeing in the early 1990s a mistake? Were the concerns that were raised at the time, were they justified? I mean, I think that it is important for those people who continue to have those concerns to provide some evidence about the ways in which things could have been handled differently. I think we have to do that remembering that there was no other game in town in D.C. There was not a large effort to think about development again, or to think about human rights again, or to think about the structure of the United Nations again. This was about what would the U.S. role be in the world after the Cold War. That's what the discussion was about. It was a sort of 7 or 8 year discussion about this. And so, I think that the environmental community was divided over whether to participate. And some of us decided to participate, and others decided not to. Now, okay, so this is some elements from the report, and I think that when you look at these are images that are photographs from the northern part of Pakistan from one of the field trips there, and you see these images. They're very, and you see the sort of the great pace of deforestation in the area, the vulnerability, and so on, and what the NRC report looks at is how changes in the hydrological system in this region, when a region that has lost much of its natural defense against things like soil erosion and mudslides and these sorts of things, because of deforestation, you end up with some very, very vulnerable places. Whether we describe this as a human security problem or a national security problem, and we certainly understand that it isn't simply climate change translates into public health setbacks automatically, but we look at this and we see that the conditions for the sorts of aggressive hydrological transformations which the IPCC is going to be arguing in 2014 are now measurable around the world. But in places like this, there are reasons to have some discussion about what's going to happen to these communities. There are reasons to ask ourselves about whether this type of flooding is with these types of effects is something that requires high-level attention. Now, so in the U.S. there was a particular opportunity. People seized hold of that opportunity. It had some long-lasting impacts. In the UN, the UN was a very interesting case because simultaneous with the end of the Cold War, the UN launched a couple of discourses, one around peace building and one around human security. And UNEP, and so this was also at the time of the Earth Summit and so on, and UNEP was very much on the margins of most of this discussion. So whether you were in the General Assembly or the Security Council or among agencies, everybody knew that UNDP and groups like that were the big players in the UN, and UNEP was a long way away. It was on the periphery of activity. And so one of the questions that came up a few years ago within UNEP was does peace building provide us with an opportunity to bring our expertise into the mainstream of UN activities? Because it looked like peace building is that bridge between security and development. And so if we become relevant to peace building, we become automatically relevant to security and development. And those are, of course, the big ticket items in the UN. So instead of being on the periphery, we start to move and bring all of this massive amount of environmental information that we've gathered over decades into the core of the UN system. And so, we prepared a justification, which was a sort of a very easy to read synopsis. And when you think of the policy community is a very sophisticated community, but it's not going to wade through academic articles. So we developed a very simplified synopsis suggesting that it made sense to think about natural resource management, climate change adaptation in the context of peace building. And that the focus of peace building on government reform, on electoral reform, on creating conditions attractive to foreign investment, on professionalizing the police and military, all important, but assessments of the conditions of the environment and identifying its priorities in this field, and building up some capacity to, reconstruct the water system, restore, the agricultural system, take stock of the fisheries and so on, that this also had to be done earlier rather than later. And it was being done in a sort of disjointed way in most peace-building operations. So the idea was to find a way to bring the environmental perspective into the room on terms that groups like UNDP and so on would take seriously. So instead of saying, yeah, we'll call you when we need you, which will be in like 10 years, we were trying to create an argument that would say, yes, you need to be there right at the outset, helping us understand what's going on, getting the bird's eye view, so that the national reconstruction plan that the government is developing, the poverty reduction strategy that the World Bank's developing, the various initiatives of donor countries and the NGO world, the ESRG and so on are trying to coordinate, will be also informed by an understanding of the environmental situation. And so, so we developed this argument, and when we presented it to the UN, the initial reaction from some players was, well, this is interesting, but it's not about security and development. This is a sort of sovereign issue, natural resource management, and so it's not really appropriate to be discussed in the context of peace building. But a lot of countries said, no, this is very important. We need this expertise to be part of these efforts. We need environmental expertise in the room when we're talking about national reconstruction. We need these projects to be identified. We need we need to build up our EPA, our capacity to do environmental impact assessments. We need to be able to position ourselves in international meetings on climate change and so on. Because right now, when we go to an international meeting on climate change, we're not really sure what we should be wanting, because we don't have very much data on our situation, and we're not really sure, what our best bargaining position is. So we need all this information. We need it quickly if we're going to. It's going to be a crucial part of the recovery. So we don't want to wait 10 years until you show up. We want it now. And so as a result of that, the Peace Building Commission said great, and I was able to lead the effort in Sierra Leone to integrate natural resource management into the peace building plan. And this turned out to be a pretty interesting experience. I won't go on for too long, but let me give you a couple of examples. There was an enormous amount of publicity around the mineral sector, the need for mineral sector reform. And in fact, our very first mission, the first mission that I was on mineral sector reform. And the idea that there was a widespread perception, with a certain amount of truth to it, that diamonds were an integral part of understanding the 10-year civil war. And there was also a widespread belief within Sierra Leone that now that the war was over, if there was adequate reform in the mining sector, there would be a wealth of capital that would be available for development, and there would be lots of jobs and so on. And the first thing we did with our assessment was we sort of took stock of the opportunities and realized that the mining sector was quite small and the diamond sector was really, really small. And the likelihood that it would generate a lot of jobs was well, there was no likelihood at all that it would generate a lot of jobs. So across the country, people were saying the only reason the mining sector is not generating jobs and wealth at the community level is because of corruption. But part of the reason was because there wasn't much wealth there. I mean, it was actually pretty small. And so it wasn't, and because of the character of the sectors, it was never going, like diamonds had become highly mechanized and was not going to create a lot of jobs no matter what. So it was a small area, but public perception around it had put a great deal of hopes around what the implications of reform of this sector would mean. So we realized very quickly that accurate information about who was in control of the mining sector and what reforms could be reasonably expected to achieve was important, but even more important was a broad assessment of what the opportunities in the immediate sort of post-conflict situation were in agriculture and fisheries. Fisheries which was entirely neglected. There was no information at all about the condition of coastal life in Sierra Leone when we arrived. There had not been any work done at all. And yet, what's that? 5 minutes, okay. So we realized that the assessment that we did could be extremely useful to UNDP and also to local civil society organizations throughout Sierra Leone which wanted accurate information about the potential of forest, fishery, agriculture, mining, water, and so on in their region. So by going around the country and collecting the first wave of data, we were able to produce a report which I think that the biggest user was the African Environmental Front, which immediately took that report and said, great, this is what we need to make the case that way too much money is going into Freetown to rebuild the government, and way too little is going into the rest of the country to create jobs and opportunities and to restore water infrastructure destroyed and so on during the civil conflict. And so we were actually the first people to go in and look at the overall environmental situation, the huge concerns of mining villages, the situation of the artisanal diamond mining, all of these challenges that you can imagine around the country. And we also did an assessment of Rwanda the decade after the peace-building initiative had started, a peace-building initiative which was not informed by an assessment of the environmental conditions of the country. And we came to the conclusion that a lot of the decisions made early in the peace-building process were having some fairly significant negative or adverse environmental impacts as things, because they had to resettle millions of people, which is on very steep hillsides, in marshlands, and we're now measuring very, very high levels of soil erosion, for example. Flood camps that ought to have lasted for a few weeks were put into permanent residences because they could not put people back into the land, and they had more and more people were being forced into the casual labor market as they discovered they could not survive farming anymore. So I think that in many ways this discourse has been useful for bringing that environmental perspective in. Now, our recent initiative has to is focused on one of the things that I think has happened is that large pockets of capital, the same large pockets of capital that were deeply implicated in the financialization of the global economy and created a whole lot of paper wealth, which was behind much of the collapse, have looked at this thing that they created themselves and said, well, that's awfully volatile. We'll take our capital out of there. So we've ruined that part of the global economy, and we've destroyed lots of things there. But we've got still lots of money. So what's our next wave of investment going to be? And they've slowly convinced themselves that land is the ideal choice. Buy land. Why? Because in many parts of the world it's cheap, and it's a platform for energy and for food. And if you create the right conditions in your concession or your purchase, you'll also get water as well. And they found clever ways to manage the risk of buying land, leasing land in different parts of the world, forcing for example, into the contract that disputes will be resolved by international law or international contract law rather than by domestic law and community laws, requiring that their land is serviced with water prior to other land around it, and so on and so forth. And many of these concessions are for 30 to 50 years, some even for 100 years. 228 million hectares of land has changed hands in the past decade alone. It's extremely cheap, and now we're seeing in countries like Ethiopia and Sudan an enormous change in who controls large amounts of land which have been purchased with the idea of producing food and a small amount for producing fuel. And a process that really lacks transparency. So one of the things we're trying to do is say, okay, these people have this is where I see this nexus between land, food, water, is large capital that is buying up land to try and because it sort of has convinced itself that this is a stable investment right now. Get out of these unstable areas of the global economy and purchase land again. Now they're discovering that there's some problems with this. They're discovering that managing 100,000 hectare pieces of land in Ethiopia are not easy. And there's no doubt that countries like Saudi Arabia are currently producing the most expensive food in the world on this land. So there are some challenges. It's also clear that their approach to risk management largely has left protection of natural capital and local communities out of the equation. So it's about their ability to transfer wealth out, about sovereignty issues, about managing political risk, about managing changes in water availability, these sorts of things, currency issues, but it's not about natural wealth and human security. So we are trying to force this into this discussion. Well, discussion which is largely taking place sort of behind closed doors. And we're trying to open it up and say, what are the terms through which these land transfers are taking place, and how do we build in a concern for human security and a concern for protecting natural capital into some of these agreements. And part of our strategy is to argue that it's actually in the investor's interest to do so for reasons from global witness on down to the actual productivity of their investment over the long haul. So I think that this is an area of huge concern. I think that again, they've internalized the environmental security literature in a peculiar way, just coming to the conclusion that, well, they ought to buy the whole thing and then figure out what that means over time. And what we're saying is just like the mining concessions in Sierra Leone, one of the problems with mining sector reform in Sierra Leone was the government's locked into concessions that were granted during the civil war itself. It's not easy to change those. So you don't just walk in and say, the war's over. We'd like to change the terms on which we leased you this land. So it's difficult after the fact. It's difficult for Rwanda now to move people out of Akagera or out of the swamplands around Kigali and so on. They're there, and those things have been lost. And we're very concerned that these deals that are being struck, which exclude concerns about natural capital and human security, are going to have long-term impacts on some very important parts of the world, in sub-Saharan Africa and so on. So from my perspective, I see some benefits to linking environment security, and I don't see a lot of empirical evidence being marshaled to support many of the concerns that have been raised. I'm not saying that there aren't concerns. Of course there are. And we should be concerned anytime we let the governments do anything. But I think that in this particular case, we have to look more carefully at what was happening in the U.S., what was happening in the UN, what is happening in sort of this area of land purchase and leasing, and ask ourselves, are we getting leverage this way, or are we somehow making things more difficult than we ought to be? And I want to at least suggest that these are important entry points that give us some leverage, which there still remains, what do we do with that leverage? What do we do when we have a seat at the table? And I'm very worried that UNEP has a seat at the table, but isn't doing enough with that seat at the table. That there is that legitimate concern. But at least it has a seat at the table now, and it didn't 10 years ago.
Thank you, Richard.